Hello again. Michael Green, in his terrific book, Evangelism in the Early Church, takes on the subject of the loss of the Old Testament to most of the church. And it's not just our problem today in the last few generations. It was a problem right from the 2nd century, at least. Maybe even while the apostles were alive, we were suffering from the downplaying of the significance of the Old Testament in face of the fact that, of course, the full glory of God was displayed in the face of Christ and the testimony to his death and resurrection particularly. But Green talks about how the loss of the Old Testament to the church, not officially because we of course canonized it, but in practice and in emphasis, the lack of Old Testament in the church's proclamation from very early in its history has led to dire consequences, starting at least as far back as the beginning of the 2nd century. Here's how he analyzes it. We have seen how the preaching to the Gentiles, though it presupposed and often enough referred to the Old Testament, began with the establishment of monotheism and the opposition to idols. Could this have meant that despite the fact that the Old Testament was very much the Bible of the church, there was no New Testament after all then, it was never really understood? Once treated as a quarry for proof texts or passages in which you see Christian meanings, and you have precluded from seeing it in its own right as the history of God's dealings with Israel, in which Christ is indeed the goal and the climax, but not the destroyer. Under these circumstances, there must have been a constant tendency to do one of two things: either to neglect the Old Testament altogether or to misunderstand its relations with the New. Marcion, of course, is the classic example of the first attitude, and the enormous impression he made on 2nd century Christianity should warn us against supposing that his rejection of the Old Testament was a mere personal quirk. There were many who thought like Marcion. There were others too who threw it over. Most of the apocryphal Gospels, for example. By the way, the apocryphal Gospels have been far more readily circulated and had their insidious impact since Green wrote this book decades ago. The apocryphal Gospels of Gnostic tendency, we'll go on to that here, to reject the Old Testament and its doctrine of creation led inevitably in a Gnostic direction, where the physical was despised and the spiritual alone valued. This in its turn led to either license or asceticism, that is, laxity or legalism, according to the predilections of the sect in question. Both were agreed in treating the body as either irrelevant or a hindrance to spiritual development. Preaching Christianity as a new philosophy, albeit God-given and ultimate, was almost inevitable in the Greco-Roman world, but it was nonetheless disastrous. It weakened the roots of the biblical doctrines of creation and of the solidarity of the new Israel and the old, which led to the two greatest dangers of the 2nd century, Gnosticism and Marcionism. The other direction in which the comparative neglect of the Old Testament by some Christian missionaries led has already been touched on. The trouble in Galatia, for example, might have been due not so much to the machinations of a counter-mission dispatched by James of Jerusalem to make good Judaizers of Paul's converts, but to Paul's own spiritualizing of the Old Testament, replacing circumcision by baptism and the like. Left to themselves after the scintillating preacher, that is Paul, had gone, they read the Septuagint and found the prime place accorded to the very literal Israel and very fleshly circumcision. Paul, they may have concluded, had only told them half the story. They would get themselves circumcised and make sure. Granted, they got short shrift from the apostle. Granted, the political and cultural circumstances of the next 80 years militated against a Judaizing of the Gentile mission. But the influence of this attitude was to be seen in other ways. The Eucharist was seen in Old Testament sacrificial terms. The ministry as Levitical priests and so on. There was a return to Old Testament categories by men who ought to have been living on New Testament lines. As we have seen, this tendency was prominent in Jewish Christianity. It came in by the back door to those Catholics who took their Old Testament both seriously and literally. This thought, by the way, this last thought of Green is developed fully by John Meyer and by Raymond Brown in their book Antioch and Rome, where they suggest, I think with quite a bit of scholarly support, that the tendencies to view the Old Testament as a continuum with the New, specifically in the areas of sacrifice and priesthood, led directly to the Roman Catholic distinctives, with which Protestants, of course, are still battling. So the neglect of the Old Testament, or the wrong teaching of it, has led to mischievous results, including a transference of Old Testament ritual and notions about authority within the church, and of course specifically the Mass and the priesthood, as being central to Roman Catholic teaching, but of course set aside by those who would cling to more of a Pauline view of how these things should be viewed. And the book of Hebrews, for example, much exalted by Protestants, has been relatively neglected in its specific teachings about the nature of priesthood, and that Christ alone has a legitimate claim upon Old Testament typology. Not the Levitical priesthood, but rather the priesthood of Melchizedek. So Michael Green here has laid the groundwork for a lot of interesting conversation and discussion about what we have lost in neglecting the Old Testament as he sees it. Legalism is one tendency in a Gnostic direction, but laxity is another tendency. Both are very visible, for instance, in the first epistle to the Corinthians, where you have the first converts of Paul in Corinth within a mere 5 years of the founding of the church in Corinth, obviously going off in a direction of laxity. And yet you see the Judaizers in the same physical context of the Roman world emphasizing, if anything, as seen in the epistle to the Galatians, the opposite tendency towards the legalism of Pharisaism. Both are distortions of the Old Testament. Both are distortions of the gospel. All this in Michael Green's book, which I strongly urge becomes a basic library item for all of us. Evangelism in the Early Church.